Hello and welcome to the channel. With the recent release of Beetlejuice Beetlejuice, aka Beetlejuice 2, aka it's probably not as good as the first film, but I'm still gonna go see it, I decided to sculpt one of the movie's most iconic non-main characters, the Sandworm. I start the build off with a ball of aluminum foil that I then begin to shape, fold, and mold until I get a good structure of what is going to be the foundation of this outer head. Or is it more of like a sleeve? Honestly, I'm not really sure how this thing works. Is it one worm? Or is it like a worm living within a worm? Or is it just one entity? I don't really know. Or is it like a hoodie, one of those zip-up hoodie? Okay. Once we get a good foundational shape, we begin to layer up clay on the outside of the armature. I'm going to be focusing on the inside of the mouth, that way we can lock in those throat details first. I take my big ball stylus, making back and forth motions to get those mouth textures that we're looking for. Once I'm happy with how the inside of the mouth looks, I go ahead and put it in the oven for its first bake. That way we don't mess up the details later on in the build. And once we pull it out of the oven, we go ahead and give it that flick test just to indicate that we actually cooked it. Then I proceed to roll out a large tapeworm for this tapeworm, which is going to make up the lumpy lips. Once I get the lips in place, I then begin to work around them and smooth them out, making sure that it kind of blends into the head a little bit better. Then add little chunks of tapeworm to kind of fill out little spots and make it a little bulgy in areas, and then I blend that in together. Really going for like a chapped lip look, or like a lip filler gone wrong type thing. Now that the inner worm's outer sleeve has properly chapped lips, it is time to add the teeth, which I had pre-baked off camera, which then we will use small pieces of clay to mush the teeth into the gum line. Then I will use a small stylus to shape and mold it all together to give it a seamless look. After a quick bake, it's time to start building up the outer part of the head. I start by adding logs of clay to the upper part of the face to give it some structure, before adding a baked potato sized tube of aluminum foil to make up the main portion of the neck. I give it a tap, or 5, to flatten up the back part, that way it can stand up on its own. I then continue to add more fat logs of clay to help thicken up the back of the head and neck before I add a large flat piece to cover up the rest. I start to smooth it all out with ball stylus, and hey, real quick fun fact there for you. Did you know that sandworms specifically from this film do not exist? Do with that what you will. Now that this outer worm jacket's all smoothed up, I begin to add eye sockets in which I will fill with pre-baked eyes. Once his balls are properly jammed into place, they get a thin piece of tapeworm that is then wrapped around the perimeter and then blended into the rest of the face. It's now time to add some finer details to this throat goat. I start with under his eyes, carving out and building up bumps and ridges that will be his under eye bags. Then I use a soft sculpting tool to start drawing out the lines which will indicate the stripes along his body. I then work around his body, poking and prodding with a small round ball stylus to indicate where the texture of the black stripes are going to be. This will give a little bit of a visual separation so that it doesn't look like we just paint the stripes on later. I popped it back into my easy bake oven really quick just to sew in the textures before starting onto its dorsal fin. We're going to start building up the fin by adding a fat log of clay that we then will pinch and pull until we get a good shape that we like. I'll then use my small ball stylus again to carry the texture up onto the fin, and then it's back into the oven and it's time to start on its little throat friend. This little guy's going to be made pretty much the same way of its larger friend, starting with an underform of aluminum foil and a piece of armature wire to give it some more structure. We give it a quick throat depth check before covering in clay. Once I'm happy with the rough shape, I fish hook this bad boy into place, then it's on to the lips. One long tapeworm and a smoothed down later receives a matching lip texture of its outer friend. The inside of the mouth gets a refined texture courtesy of my small ball stylus, followed up by jamming some pre-baked eyeballs into the side of his face. I start to add bits of clay around his eyes, then I smooth those out to make his upper and lower eyelid. I lay down a few small fat logs of clay which are going to indicate the upper eyebrow ridge. Then I go in and lay down some under eye wrinkles, followed by some outer mouth folds. Then I proceed to add holes in the mouth which are going to indicate where the teeth are going to lie. Now it's time for creating the tongue. I start off with a long piece of tapeworm, then I roll it out to make one side smaller than the other. Start to shape and mold it until I get a good shape that I'm looking for. Then it's onto the tray in which I will wipe it down using a paintbrush and some isopropyl alcohol to get rid of any of my fingerprints. Then it's onto the oven for a bake. Once his tongue is nice and solid, I mash it into the back of his throat. I'm happy with the placement, so now it's time to start adding the teeth. I added small balls of clay to each tooth, that way it can create a little bit of gum texture. Now that this little guy's got his new grill, it's time to put it in the oven for its final bake. Now that this Hot Pocket's baked to perfection, we can start applying some paint, starting with the black stripes. For this project, I'm just using a basic heavy body acrylic paint. In the future, I'm probably going to use something different, but for now, it's working just fine. For the white stripes, I do go ahead and paint them with a off-white color. I just felt like it respected the Tim Burton aesthetic a little bit better. I then began to paint the eyes, in which they receive a vibrant red, followed by a yellow dot right in the center. The inside of his mouth receives a pink blush tone, and then his lips get a light blue that have a slight gray undertone. And then it's time to begin the grueling process of painting the little tiny stripes around each tooth. I did apply a thin black wash around the whole entire thing. I forgot to film it for some reason, but I did do it. We then move on to painting the outside of the head. This head gets a full coat of that same off-white color that the outer head had. His eyes get a reverse color scheme compared to his outer friend, but with a bit more detail. I start off with a yellow base coat, then followed by a red dot in the center. We make a black outline with a black pupil to finish it up. It then gets an array of various size wonky spots to cover up the front portion of his face. His lips get that classic light blue with a touch of gray look. Then the same blush pink to cover the gums and inner mouth. I was a little sloppy with the pink, but it was intentional because I planned on painting the tongue and the teeth white anyway. I then give the whole thing a good soak with a dark wash to help bring out some detail in the recesses. I use a little bit of a thicker wash around the eyes to give it a little bit more depth. Then it's on to painting the stripes around the tongue. And with that, it's on to those wonderful JCPenney beauty shots. Well, there you have it, folks. One worm straight out of Beetlejuice. If you enjoyed watching me wrestle this worm, be sure to hit that like button. If you're new here, consider subscribing so you don't miss out on the next time I try to tackle something way out of my league. Leave a comment down below what you'd like to see next, or even if you just want to say, hey, nice worm. I'd love to hear it. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.